FromSoftware is a company known for creating unique and challenging games in an industry that often plays it safe with how it makes games. They are especially dedicated to expressing their artistic vision, not allowing it to be hampered in any way that would satisfy others but hurt their creative process. Therefore, sticking to this vision, FromSoftware would end up creating a new subgenre that would be called Souls-likes, after the success of Dark Souls. This would have not been possible without the ingenuity of Hidetaka Miyazaki, taking a project that was considered a failure and molding it into his idea of a dark fantasy role-playing game. Throughout the years, FromSoftware has developed and shipped several games. Many of them have been based off of the formula of Demon's Souls, each of them iterating on a new twist to this still evolving formula that is yet to be fully realized. Dark Souls taking the goal of achieving a seamless world that is all interconnected to each other. Bloodborne being a radical shift from the typical setting into a gothic Victorian era setting with guns and Lovecraftian themes. Sekiro perfecting its combat through building it solely around one weapon and one mechanic. Elden Ring, the culmination of all of these games, but into a much grander scale, turning the game into a massive open world with tons to see and do. Elden Ring was a drastic departure from the traditional Souls games. With this, you would get an open world game that didn't play like your typical open world game. The trend throughout these games are that they are all new IPs. None of these games are related to each other in any way other than sharing the same developer. FromSoftware doesn't follow trends from other games, but seeks to create games that inspires others. The purpose of this video is to give insight into why From strays away from making sequels and tends to focus on new IPs instead. FromSoftware was a niche studio that was known for its mech series of games called Armored Core. This was their most prominent franchise that has had multiple installments since the first in 1997. Although this was their most well-recognized game, they have made others before Armored Core. Their very first game was Kingsfield, that was successful in Japan and would get a few more games. Only Armored Core would last throughout the years, with it receiving a sequel, Armored Core 6 Fires Rubicon, last August after a 10-year hiatus. Armored Core 6 would sell more than the entire series combined due to their popularity from recent releases. Before reaching mainstream, FromSoftware would struggle to sell very many copies, or finding a big enough audience, many of their one-off games not being enough to consider localizing, with not meeting enough sales to afford a sequel that would be localized. There were many cases of games not being released over to the West that were sequels to these games. They fully embraced experimentalism with their gameplay, music composition, or general aesthetics. You may be wondering where FromSoftware has gotten their way of storytelling. Well, this would stem from Kingsfield. You would see this later in the Souls series. Environmental storytelling was something that they often did, and it was built upon further in games that would follow with complex lore and puzzling stories. As I mentioned previously, this experimentation with their games led to many not getting sequels. They would experiment even with their specialty, mech games. They would make games such as Metal Wolf Chaos, that was a silly game where you would play as the President of the United States. It was made to boost the popularity of Xbox in Japan, and it led to hilarious results. It would be brought to 8th gen consoles and PC in 2019. Afterwards, Ace, short for Another Century's Episode, is a mech game where you play as mechs from different animes. Although Metal Wolf Chaos unfortunately did not receive any sequels, Ace was successful and received 3 more games. Later on, they would release even more mech games, but not being related to Armored Core. Chrome Hounds, Mobile Suit Gundam Unicorn. Lastly, Steel Battalion, which was controlled with the Kinect. Stepping away from the mech games for a moment, Enchanted Arms was an RPG that was a little different from what you typically expect from FromSoftware. It's a rather forgiving game, follows the mold of what you'd expect from a JRPG extremely faithfully. It has environments that are familiar to what you would expect from Dark Souls in terms of structures and landscapes. For one reason or another, they have the Vanguard demon in the game, which is foreshadowing for later. I don't plan to cover all the games that they've developed or helped on, but just key games on the portfolio to build a picture of what they were like pre-Souls. A common link between these games is the aversion From has to the sequel-based development. Yes, they make sequels to their games, but with how much they experimented, it heavily outweighs this. The uniqueness of their portfolio is something you'd never really see in the gaming industry. After Demon's Souls, they would hone in on this formula and seek to further add on to it. Miyazaki has changed everything, from the direction of the company to the gaming landscape as a whole. Not to say it's solely his fault, it's that he's a part of the larger whole. His direction on these games to his team would lead to them pushing boundaries within their games. The hyperfixation of pushing graphical fidelity to its utmost limit while leaving gameplay mostly stagnant is something you see a lot in the big AAA gaming industry today. This is an important point for later. Demon's Souls was a success, even though Sony had its doubts about the quality as well as the potential sales of the project. This is a fact that still haunts them to this day, and would lead to them letting go of one of the best developers in the industry, and later on buy a stake in its parent company Kadokawa. Not being able to make a sequel to Demon's Souls due to Sony owning the license to the game, FromSoftware would make a spiritual successor, Dark Souls. Dark Souls, in Miyazaki's own words, is a game for lovers of video games. This would end up appealing to those who wanted a more hands-off approach that would leave the thinking to you in terms of how you play throughout the game on top of how you interpret the game's world and narrative. This is something radically different from the other games at the time. This would form a long-lasting audience that would continue to grow as they added on to this formula. They very well could have made a Dark Souls 4, even though Miyazaki wanted to end it with Dark Souls 3, but they would pursue other projects, such as Sekiro, Elden Ring, and whatever comes next. This bold decision to take great risks with new IPs instead of playing it safe with consecutive sequels would lead to even greater success. I want to talk about the company president of FromSoftware again for a moment and his feelings towards sequels and what that entails. In an interview with Game Central after the release of the Notorious DLC, Miyazaki was asked whether there would be more DLC or a continuation of the Dark Souls franchise. He replied, "Even if a sequel of the Dark Souls is decided to be created, it is still uncertain whether I will be chosen to get involved in the development since the decision maker is not me, so I better not say anything about the uncertainty. If I reveal my unprepared opinions here, the decision makers may scold me." Reading this statement from Miyazaki, we can determine a few things. Firstly, he is not the person making decisions at the current time. Secondly, he was not sure whether he would be chosen to work on the potential sequel. There are more quotes that I want to highlight to further show my point. Dark Souls would indeed receive a sequel, but this would come without Miyazaki directing it. The second game would start development shortly after the first game would release. The person who would make these decisions was the former president, Naotoshi Shin. He would install himself as the lead game designer, and put someone else as a director. It's no secret that Dark Souls 2 had a very troubled development, going through 2 different directors for its development cycle over the course of 30 months. Without going too in-depth, I want to put forth this distinct ideological difference between the company and Miyazaki. Bandai Namco and the former president want a franchise to build sequels upon their success. Conversely, Miyazaki sees this as a less than enjoyable, and prefers to work on new IPs, as they grant more freedom on how you approach development. Miyazaki has no decision on whether there or not Dark Souls would receive another entry, but did have the opportunity to work on something new with Bloodborne. Next would come something unexpected. FromSoftware was bought up by a company called Kadokawa in April of 2014. Naturally, the company was restructured to adjust to this change, so in turn, Miyazaki was promoted to the company president. With this leadership changing, the direction in which the company would follow would of course go in the way he sees fit. The current project at the time being another sequel to Dark Souls, Dark Souls 3, would be the final entry so they can refocus on new IP. Miyazaki would go on to say this about Dark Souls 3. Dark Souls 3 is a turning point for the Dark Souls series. Dark Souls has a truly unique worldview. continuously releasing titles for the series isn't a good idea due to that uniqueness. This project will likely mark the turning point for FromSoftware as a whole. This is further confirmation and doubling down on this path of new IPs and straying away from sequels. Not to say there will never be another sequel for a previous FromSoftware game, as Armored Core got one after 10 years, but why else would there not be a Bloodborne 2, or a Sekiro 2, even a Dark Souls 4, just as there won't be an Elden Ring 2. There is a lack of motivation to follow up these games because of Miyazaki's passion for creating new games and new experiences that he simply can't achieve with sequels. Staying true to his creative vision, he would follow through with his plan of creating new, interesting games. This same resolve also applies to his decisions to put the games first before the story, no difficulty sliders, environmental storytelling, overcoming adversity through learning and growing into a better player. After he would win the 2022 Game of the Year award for FromSoftware's biggest release ever, Elden Ring, he would state in his acceptance speech his goal to make even more interesting games.
大変で問題の多いプロジェクトだったので、ディレクターとしてはすごくホッとしています。そしてですね、このゲームオブザイヤーという、最高の栄をいただいた場でいうことではないのかもしれませんけれども、これからも今よりもこのゲームよりもですね、面白いゲームを作っていこうと決意してますので、ぜひよろしくお願いします。
We have faced so many difficulties while developing this game, so as a director, I'm really relieved. And this might not be the light thing to say at on the occasion of the receiving the GOTY award, but I have made up my mind to create even more interesting games than this one.
Now, there may be some contention to this idea that only making new IPs or relying on new IPs is too risky and not giving the fans what they want. Innovation is what drives these developers forward, as well as the industry at large. I understand the disappointment that may bring from FromSoftware letting go of these beloved IPs to pursue new IPs. You may not get to explore more of the world that you may have not previously seen, but you must consider that there have been a lot of benefits from creating new IP at FromSoftware. We might not have gotten Bloodborne, Elden Ring, or Sekiro if they stayed on the previous path. I don't believe this is something that will always work for everyone, but the team at FromSoftware always makes interesting games. There is also the perspective that all of their games are just Souls games with different coat of paint, which couldn't be further from the truth because it's probably coming from someone who's played a little bit of one or two of the games and hasn't delved into these much more than that. He heavily played these games and just dabbled in them. All of them do a different spin on the formula. Miyazaki has acknowledged that there may come a day where this formula will grow stale, works to avoiding that. The best of Elden Ring is what they have learned from making Dark Souls and others. FromSoftware believes that the best way to innovate this formula is to have it reflect in this new IP. New IP is the lifeline of FromSoftware and pushes this medium forward to greater heights. He has not failed us yet, so I have my full faith in this commitment to see this vision through, of creating new, interesting experiences that will shock everyone, whether or not has it paid off. Thank you for watching. Leave a like if you enjoyed the video, and consider subscribing or sharing my video. You have a nice rest of your day.